My 8-year-old put a teenager in the hospital, and the judge asked for her advice. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone started buzzing incessantly. 3 missed calls from Riverside Elementary in 2 minutes, followed by a text from Principal Hartwell that made my blood freeze. Come immediately. Police involved. Urgent situation with Zoe. I grabbed my keys and ran to the parking lot, my mind spinning through every possible scenario. Zoe was 8 years old, quiet, the kind of kid who spent recess reading instead of playing. She'd never been in trouble for anything more serious than talking during library time. The drive to school took 15 minutes that felt like hours. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw 3 police cars and an ambulance, its lights flashing but sirens off. My stomach dropped as I walked through the front entrance, trying to control my breathing and failing completely. The receptionist's expression told me everything before she spoke. That practiced look of professional concern mixed with something that might have been fear or disbelief. She directed me to the principal's office without making eye contact, and I could hear multiple voices arguing down the hallway before I even reached the door. Principal Hartwell stood when I entered, her face pale as she gestured to a chair. I remained standing because sitting felt like accepting whatever nightmare was about to unfold. Across from her desk sat a woman I recognized from school events, Mrs. Blackwood, whose son Connor was in high school. She was clutching a tissue and glaring at me with pure hatred. Mrs. Blackwood spoke first, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. She informed me that my daughter had viciously attacked her 16-year-old son during lunch recess, causing injuries severe enough to require surgery and potentially permanent nerve damage. She added that Connor was an honor student and star athlete who'd never done anything to provoke such violence from a child. The words hung in the air like accusations, and I felt my knees weaken before I forced myself to stay focused. "Where is Zoe?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. Principal Hartwell explained that she was in the counselor's office being evaluated, and that's when Officer Valdez stepped forward from where he'd been standing by the window. He was middle-aged with kind eyes, but his expression was grim as he explained that based on the severity of the injuries and witness statements, he would need to take Zoe to the station for processing. Processing. The word hit me like a physical blow. Fingerprints and photographs and my 8-year-old daughter being treated like a criminal. Mrs. Blackwood started talking again, describing how Connor had been eating lunch peacefully when Zoe had apparently attacked him without warning, striking him with something hard enough to fracture his skull and cause a concussion. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of Connor in a hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages, his face swollen beyond recognition. But something didn't make sense. Zoe weighed maybe 55 pounds and had never shown any signs of aggression. I asked if I could see my daughter first before we discussed anything else. Principal Hartwell nodded, leading me down the hallway while Officer Valdez followed at a respectful distance. Mrs. Blackwood stayed behind, but I could feel her hatred boring into my back. The counselor's office smelled like vanilla and old books. Zoe sat in an oversized chair with her legs drawn up to her chest, looking impossibly small. Her right knuckles were scraped raw, dried blood visible in the creases of her small fingers. When she looked up at me, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear or guilt, but a kind of cold determination that made her look older than her 8 years. The school counselor, Ms. Rivera, pulled me aside and whispered that Zoe had refused to explain what happened, just kept asking if Sammy was okay. I had no idea who Sammy was or why Zoe would be more concerned about some other child than the fact that she was about to be arrested. I sat down next to my daughter and took her uninjured hand, asking her as calmly as I could manage to tell me what happened. She looked at me with those suddenly ancient eyes and said 5 words that changed everything. "Connor was hurting little Sammy, Dad." My breath caught in my throat. Sammy Fletcher was a 5-year-old with autism who attended the school's special needs program. He was nonverbal and had severe sensory processing issues that made him vulnerable to overstimulation and meltdowns. Zoe explained in her small voice that she'd been reading under the big oak tree when she heard crying coming from behind the maintenance shed. When she went to investigate, she found Connor and 2 of his friends surrounding Sammy, who was on the ground rocking back and forth and making the distressed sounds he made when overwhelmed. Connor was filming with his phone while his friends threw pebbles at Sammy and laughed. I felt rage flash through me so intense I had to grip the chair arms to stay grounded. Zoe described how she'd told them to stop, but Connor had just laughed and said something about getting content for his social media. He'd then deliberately poured his chocolate milk over Sammy's head while still filming, causing the little boy to have a complete meltdown. Sammy had started hitting himself in the head, which only made the teenagers laugh harder. That's when Zoe had apparently picked up a rock from the ground and thrown it as hard as she could at Connor's head. The rock had struck him in the temple with enough force to drop him immediately. She'd then helped Sammy get cleaned up and walked him back to his classroom before anyone found Connor unconscious behind the shed. The counselor's office door opened and Officer Valdez stepped in, his expression apologetic as he explained that he needed to take Zoe to the station now. I found myself saying wait, asking if they'd checked Connor's phone for the video Zoe mentioned. The officer looked confused, said no one had mentioned any video, and I explained what Zoe had just told me while he took notes with increasing interest. Principal Hartwell appeared in the doorway, asking what the delay was, and I repeated Zoe's story while she listened with growing concern. She admitted they'd only talked to Connor's friends, who all claimed Zoe had attacked without provocation, and no one had thought to check on Sammy or look for video evidence. We walked back to the principal's office in tense silence. Mrs. Blackwood looked up expectantly when we entered, immediately demanding to know why there was a delay in processing the assault charges. I looked at her and asked as calmly as I could if she'd seen what her son had been doing before Zoe hit him. She said with absolute confidence that her son had been eating lunch peacefully until he was violently attacked by a disturbed child. Officer Valdez cleared his throat and asked if she would object to him reviewing the contents of Connor's phone, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Mrs. Blackwood started to say something about privacy and warrants, but Principal Hartwell interrupted and said the school had the right to examine any electronic device involved in an incident on school property. They called Mrs. Blackwood's husband from the hospital. While we waited for him to arrive, Officer Valdez took statements from Sammy's teacher and aide, who confirmed that Sammy had returned to class covered in chocolate milk and highly agitated. The aide mentioned that when they'd tried to clean him up, he'd kept signing "Big Boys Mean" and "Zoe Help," which was unusual because Sammy rarely communicated about events. Mr. Blackwood arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing surgical scrubs from the hospital where he worked as an anesthesiologist. He looked exhausted and worried until he saw the setup in the principal's office, then his expression hardened into professional anger. He demanded to know why his critically injured son was being treated like a suspect instead of a victim. Officer Valdez explained the allegations calmly, and Mr. Blackwood's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like dawning horror. He asked to speak with his wife privately, and they stepped into the hallway for a heated whispered conversation that we could hear through the thin walls. When they returned, Mrs. Blackwood looked like she'd aged a decade. Mr. Blackwood handed over Connor's phone without being asked again. Officer Valdez scrolled through it for less than a minute before his expression darkened significantly. He turned the screen toward Principal Hartwell without comment, and I watched her face transform from professional concern to genuine disgust. She covered her mouth with one hand as she finished viewing whatever was there. The officer asked if I wanted to see it, and I nodded, even though I already knew it was going to destroy me. The video was exactly what Zoe had described, but worse. Connor had been providing running commentary as he and his friends tormented Sammy, calling him a retard and making jokes about how easy it was to make him freak out. The footage showed them throwing things at the little boy while he rocked and cried, culminating in Connor pouring milk over his head while Sammy had a complete sensory meltdown. The video was 4 minutes and 23 seconds long, and by the end I was shaking so hard I had to sit down. Connor had zoomed in on Sammy's face while he screamed and hit himself, adding text overlays that mocked his disability. The casual cruelty was breathtaking, and the worst part was hearing Connor and his friends laugh while a vulnerable child suffered. Officer Valdez turned to the Blackwoods and asked in a carefully neutral tone if they were aware their son had been systematically abusing a disabled child. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Blackwood tried to recover, saying that boys will be boys, and maybe Connor had shown poor judgment, but that didn't justify attempted murder. I felt something snap inside me. I stood up and asked her in a voice I barely recognized as my own if she was seriously trying to minimize her son's deliberate torture of a nonverbal autistic 5-year-old. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. Mr. Blackwood had the grace to look ashamed, staring at the floor like he couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. I pressed my advantage by pointing out that the video showed clear evidence of disability hate crimes and systematic abuse. Officer Valdez added that depending on how the district attorney viewed it, there could be federal charges related to disability harassment and creating harmful content involving a minor. Suddenly, the Blackwoods were the ones looking worried. Principal Hartwell found her voice and said she would be recommending Connor's immediate expulsion and that the district would be reviewing all security footage to see if this was part of a pattern. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Mrs. Blackwood began talking frantically about how Connor was a good kid who'd made a mistake, how he was planning to go to medical school, how this would ruin his entire future. Officer Valdez asked if I wanted to press charges against Connor for the assault on Sammy, and I looked at my daughter sitting there with her scraped knuckles and fierce eyes and said yes, absolutely. The Blackwoods started negotiating immediately. Mr. Blackwood offering to pay for Sammy's therapy, Mrs. Blackwood suggesting they could handle this privately without involving the legal system. I listened to them negotiate against themselves for a full minute before I interrupted and said the only thing I wanted was for them to drop all charges against Zoe and for Connor to be held accountable for what he'd done to Sammy. Mrs. Blackwood looked like she wanted to argue, but her husband was already nodding, seeing the writing on the wall. Any lawsuit would expose their son's behavior to public scrutiny and destroy his college prospects. Principal Hartwell said she would be contacting the district's legal team and recommended both families seek counseling for their children. The Blackwoods left quickly, their earlier righteous anger replaced by shame and panic. Officer Valdez stayed to take formal statements, explaining that the video evidence meant Zoe was unlikely to face any charges and that the district attorney would review everything to determine if action against Connor was warranted. He also mentioned that what Zoe had done would likely be classified as defense of another person, which was legally justified. We drove home in silence, Zoe cradling her injured hand. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, trying to reconcile this fierce protector with the gentle child who cried over hurt animals. At home, she asked if she was in trouble, and I had to figure out how to explain that I was simultaneously proud of her for protecting Sammy and terrified by the violence she'd been capable of. That night, I called Sammy's parents to check on him. His mother, Maria, broke down crying when I told her what had happened. She said Sammy had been having nightmares for weeks, but couldn't communicate what was wrong. She'd noticed he'd become afraid of older boys and would have meltdowns whenever they went to public places with teenagers around. Now she understood why. The next morning, we drove to the police station to complete Officer Valdez's paperwork. He met us in a family-friendly interview room and asked Zoe to tell her story one more time on the record. She went through it calmly, her voice steady as she described finding Sammy being tortured and making the split-second decision to act. Officer Valdez told her that protecting people who couldn't protect themselves was one of the most important things anyone could do. He explained that the district attorney had reviewed the video evidence and decided to pursue charges against Connor for assault, harassment of a disabled person, and creation of exploitative content involving a minor. The charges were serious enough that Connor would likely face juvenile detention and mandatory counseling. Plus, his college applications would be affected by his criminal record. We left the station with assurances that no charges would be filed against Zoe. I took her for pancakes on the way home, and she ate quietly while I tried to process everything that had happened. She asked if Connor would be okay, and I was struck by the fact that she was concerned about the teenager who had tormented Sammy. I explained that his injuries would heal, but the consequences for his actions would last much longer. My phone rang as we were finishing breakfast. It was an unknown number that turned out to be Judge Catherine Russo from the juvenile court system. She asked if we could meet to discuss Zoe's case, and I agreed, curious about what a judge could want with an 8-year-old who wasn't being charged with anything. Judge Russo's chambers were lined with law books and family photos. She was a woman in her 60s with kind but shrewd eyes who'd clearly seen everything in her decades on the bench. She asked Zoe to sit across from her and explain what had happened in her own words. Zoe went through the story again, and Judge Russo listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about Zoe's decision-making process. When Zoe finished, Judge Russo leaned back in her chair and studied my daughter for a long moment. She said she'd been reviewing juvenile cases for 25 years and had rarely seen such clear moral reasoning in a child. She asked Zoe why she'd chosen to throw the rock instead of running to get help, and Zoe explained that by the time she found a teacher, Connor might have hurt Sammy worse or posted the video online. Judge Russo nodded slowly and said that kind of split-second ethical decision-making was something they tried to teach in law school, but rarely succeeded. She pulled out a legal pad and asked if she could ask Zoe some questions about fairness and justice. For the next hour, she posed hypothetical scenarios to my 8-year-old daughter, who answered with a clarity and moral consistency that seemed to fascinate the judge. Finally, Judge Russo set down her pen and looked at me. She said that in her experience, most adults struggled with the ethical complexities that Zoe had navigated instinctively. She asked if Zoe would be interested in participating in a youth advisory program she was developing, where children could provide input on juvenile justice policies from a peer perspective. Zoe's eyes lit up at the idea, and Judge Russo explained that the program would meet monthly to discuss fairness in schools, bullying prevention, and how to help kids who were different or vulnerable. She said Zoe's perspective would be valuable because she'd demonstrated both moral courage and practical wisdom in an impossible situation. 2 weeks later, Connor was formally charged and entered a guilty plea as part of a deal that included intensive therapy, community service at a special needs facility, and a suspended sentence that would be expunged if he completed all requirements. The video evidence was so damning that his attorney had advised him not to fight the charges. Meanwhile, Zoe started attending Judge Russo's youth advisory meetings. She was the youngest participant by several years, but her insights about protecting vulnerable children led to new anti-bullying protocols being implemented across the school district. Judge Russo told me privately that Zoe had an intuitive understanding of justice that was remarkable in someone so young. The school district made significant changes following the incident. They implemented mandatory training on disability awareness, increased supervision of isolated areas, and created a peer support program where older students were trained to protect younger ones. Principal Hartwell personally apologized to our family and to Sammy's parents for the supervision failures that had allowed the abuse to continue undetected. Sammy's parents sent us a card thanking Zoe for protecting their son. Inside was a drawing Sammy had made showing 2 stick figures, one small one helping a smaller one, with the word "friend" written in shaky letters. Maria Fletcher called to say that Sammy's nightmares had stopped and he'd started using sign language to ask about Zoe Nice during his therapy sessions. Officer Valdez stopped by our house a month later to check on how Zoe was processing everything. She showed him the advisory program materials Judge Russo had given her, explaining how they were working on making schools safer for kids like Sammy. He told her that most adults never developed the courage to stand up for others the way she had, and that her actions had probably prevented other children from being victimized. The media picked up the story when Connor's sentencing was finalized, but they kept the children's identities protected. The headlines focused on the juvenile justice system's response to disability hate crimes and the role of bystander intervention in protecting vulnerable populations. Judge Russo was quoted extensively about the importance of moral education and the potential for restorative justice in cases involving young offenders. 3 months after the incident, I got a call from Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a child psychologist who specialized in moral development. She'd heard about Zoe's case through Judge Russo and asked if she could interview Zoe for a research study on ethical decision-making in children. She was particularly interested in how young children processed complex moral scenarios involving competing loyalties and immediate physical intervention. Zoe agreed to participate, and Dr. Kellerman spent several sessions with her, using art therapy and hypothetical scenarios to understand her thought processes. She told me afterward that Zoe demonstrated what researchers called exceptional moral precocity, the ability to make sophisticated ethical judgments typically seen only in much older children or adults. Dr. Kellerman asked if she could follow Zoe's development longitudinally, studying how early moral courage translated into leadership abilities over time. She explained that children who intervened to protect others often went on to careers in law, medicine, or social justice, and she was interested in documenting that pathway. Judge Russo invited our family to attend Connor's final hearing, where he was completing his community service requirements. Connor had spent 6 months working with special needs children and their families, and his supervising therapist reported that he'd shown genuine remorse and understanding of the harm he'd caused. Connor asked to speak to Zoe directly, and she agreed. He apologized with tears in his eyes, telling her that working with disabled children had taught him how wrong he'd been and how much damage his actions could have caused. He said he understood why she'd had to stop him and that he was grateful she'd prevented him from hurting Sammy worse. Zoe listened seriously and told him she hoped he'd keep helping other kids who needed protection. Judge Russo used Connor's case as a model for other juvenile offenders, implementing mandatory disability sensitivity training and victim impact programs. She credited Zoe's insights with helping design interventions that actually changed behavior rather than just punishing it. The youth advisory program Zoe participated in became a permanent part of the court system. Years later, when Zoe was applying to law schools and writing essays about formative experiences, she would tell the story of the day she hospitalized a teenager and a judge asked for her advice. She'd write about learning that protecting others sometimes required difficult choices, but that understanding right from wrong was only the beginning of doing justice. She'd describe Judge Russo's mentorship and how it had shaped her decision to pursue disability rights law, specializing in cases where vulnerable people needed advocates who understood both courage and consequence. And she'd include a photocopy of the letter Sammy's parents had sent, the physical reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought by the smallest warriors who refuse to let cruelty go unchallenged.